Hello, I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. They say you can judge a society by how it treats its prisoners. In Russia, that judgment comes back stained with blood, broken ribs, and electric wires. This isn't rogue brutality. This is doctrine, you see. The torture of Ukrainian prisoners of war isn't a lapse. It is not a breakdown of discipline or a foot soldier's drunken rage. For Russia, torture isn't collateral damage. It is a system, designed, refined, and deployed like a weapon. Today on Eastern Express, we're shining a light on the Kremlin's systemic, sadistic campaign against Ukrainian prisoners of war, and why the word torture barely scratches the surface. Here is a look at our latest report.
Over the course of the war in Ukraine, hundreds of prisoners of war have been exchanged between both sides. For the captured Ukrainian soldiers, however, their time in captivity was far more of an ordeal than for their Russian counterparts. According to an Associated Press report, more than 200 Ukrainian POWs died in prison since the start of the Russian invasion. Many of the Ukrainian soldiers who return have harrowing tales to share about how they were treated by the Russians. It's as if nothing has changed between the Soviet Union of the 1940s and modern Russia.
They beat us every day for standing up together or moving around. They called the beatings re-education. They said, this is so that you don't want to fight anymore, and you don't know what you're fighting for.
Ukrainian authorities say that the bodies of soldiers that Russia returns have often been mutilated, most likely to cover up signs of torture and abuse. The Russians themselves have refused to comment on the issue and instead deflect about the alleged treatment of their own soldiers in Ukrainian captivity. There are other signs of how the Russians treat prisoners. In the liberated parts of Ukraine, one can find buildings and rooms repurposed into torture chambers. Some of these were used to hold not just soldiers, but innocent civilians. It is not unusual in any war for returning soldiers to face a different kind of opponent, severe mental health issues. Many countries have extensive infrastructure in place meant to facilitate recovery. Ukraine is no different, especially in the case of former POWs, who, as reports show, have had to go through a hellish ordeal at Russian hands.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. A former Ukrainian prisoner of war died a month after returning from captivity. Serhiy Dobrovolsky had been held by the Russians since 2023. His is but the latest in a chain of unexpected deaths among former prisoners of war.
Ukrainian society is faced with a very serious issue. Once the tears of joy and reunion have dried and former POWs re-enter society, it is not uncommon for the soldiers to struggle with civilian life. What isn't immediately obvious, however, is that several of these men often die weeks after they return home. Many of them reportedly suffered torture at the hands of the Russians, as well as psychological trauma and starvation. Such treatment has very far-reaching consequences, even years after a prisoner has been freed. It is not just a struggle with mental health issues, but also with physical rehabilitation, as the Ukrainian soldiers who return from captivity often do so with having lost dozens of kilos and having suffered severe body mutilations. Ukraine's public broadcaster announced that in Dobrovolsky's case, he died in his sleep, presumably due to heart failure. Although international organizations have condemned Russia's horrific treatment of POWs and civilians in occupied territories, Ukraine's population itself must remain vigilant and provide its returning heroes with all and any medical and psychological assistance that they may require.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. Over 3 years into this war of conquest, thousands of Ukrainian POWs have returned with stories that belong in the archives of war crimes tribunals. They speak of camps run not with discipline, but with medieval sadism. Take Sergeant Yevgeny Malik, a Mariupol defender and veteran of the 36th Marine Brigade, for example. He survived more than 2 years in various Russian POW camps. Torture, he said, was a daily routine. Plastic bags over heads, electric shocks to the ears, needles under fingernails, dogs trained to maul, messages carved or branded into flesh. And it wasn't just for punishment, it was for fun. These poor people aren't being punished for violating prison rules. No, they are being brutalized for the simple act of existing. The Kremlin wants them not just broken, but erased. Their dignity, their bodies, and their will, all gone. In this network of cruelty, colony number 10 in Mordovia stands out. It has become infamous, even among Russia's own Gulag revivalists. Former captives described not only beatings, but a deliberate strategy of medical neglect. Infected wounds left to fester, pneumonia left untreated, bones broken and left to heal wrong. A place where even the camp doctor, Ilya Sorokin, nicknamed Dr. Evil, roams the halls with a stun gun. He doesn't heal, though he inflicts the pain. Starvation is routine. 4 POWs have died of exhaustion alone. Some released in exchanges weighed under 50 kilos. These are grown men, not survivors, but shadows of themselves. And then there are the civilians, like Serhiy, a 49-year-old man who never wore a uniform, never held a weapon, and spoke only Russian. According to Putin, this is the kind of man the war was meant to protect. Instead, he's still in a Russian cell, still being tortured. Some observers draw comparisons to Imperial Japan's treatment of Allied prisoners in World War II. That is not hyperbole. In both cases, torture was an institutional tactic, a means of asserting supremacy through human degradation. Russia's POW system is not failing, it is succeeding at being inhumane by design. And what is the Kremlin's response to all this, you may ask? Well, it is denial, gaslighting. State TV coverage barely acknowledges these camps even exist. Russian prosecutors fabricate charges against prisoners. A man was once forced to confess to murdering someone based on a radio order transmitted 13 kilometers away, beyond the range of the device. Because why bother with realism when you have power? It is psychological warfare. It is a message to every Ukrainian soldier still fighting. If we catch you, we won't just defeat you, we will deconstruct you. No amount of Kremlin spin or propaganda can repackage this horror show into patriotism. These are not rogue actors. This is state-sponsored sadism. And the world has a name for that. It is called a war crime. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Maria Ionova, Ukrainian MP and co-founder of the Ukrainian Women's Congress. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. Thank you for invitation. Hello.
So the treatment of Ukrainian POWs by the Russians, aren't you shocked that this topic isn't actually grabbing the headlines all across the world, that it seems to have actually been buried beneath various other news items, and we're no longer talking about this as much as we should, perhaps?
First of all, I would like to thank you to raise such important topic for us, because unfortunately, believe me, as a parliamentarian, and we as MPs, when we were addressing to so many organizations, governments, and to the world to be more vocal about such brutal war crimes. Unfortunately, this topic was not very interested, and how to say, painful that we were not able to share the truth of absolutely brutal and horrible, war crimes with our Ukrainian soldiers and people, because as you have mentioned, and what is the main issue, that Russia's brutal and systematic abuse of Ukrainian prisoners of war is deliberate state policy, violating absolutely international humanitarian law and, of course, Geneva Conventions. And these actions are aimed at spreading fear, breaking morale, and absolutely undermining Ukraine's resilience.
If you were to name one specific example that could perhaps draw the attention of the media worldwide to this issue, one that you find to be the most shocking, the most terrifying, what would that be?
Each case is absolutely horrible and painful, and the international community really must respond firmly and ensure accountability. But for me, as I also, it's not only for last 3 years; it's also started in 2014, and unfortunately, we even do not know how many still cases are on temporary occupied territory Russians are doing. But the most horrified, of course, is castrations. It's castrations for men, for our soldiers, and this castrations is very brutal and horrified. We even, um, in many cases, we are not able with our partners in different countries for transplantations, we are not able to help these people. And of course, it's also about children. It's not only about prisoners of war, it's also about children who we are trying to return. But with the also that war crimes and that mothers also who are prisoners in Russian on Russian territory when they were forcibly separated with their child. And I can tell you that when Mariupol was evacuated, when all that block posts have been, I talked to one mom, and I still in my ears the scream of the 4 years boy, 4 years old boy, who was screaming because his mom was separated with him, and they took her to Russian prisoners, to Russian prison. That is why all this testimonies from thousands of returned Ukrainian prisoners of war confirm really tortures, humiliation, denial of food and medical care, and physiological abuse. Because I can tell you, I personally visited 3 or 4 prisons in Ukraine where Russian soldiers have been, and they have all the access, they have medical care, they have all the when they're getting letters from their beloved people, they are visited by International Red Cross committee, so we are not violating international law and Geneva Convention. And that is why, of course, abuse of prisoners of war is a war crime under the Geneva Convention. And Russia treats prisoners of war as hostages, absolutely violating fundamental humanitarian norms. That is why, of course, I think that a lot of international organizations shouldn't be in silence, because we are documenting all cases. Yes, I can confirm that with cooperation with UN, as I have mentioned, with International Red Cross Committee, OSCE, but for example, if we will take OSCE, Russia is still the member of this organization. And when we are demanding full Red Cross access to Russian detention facilities and transparency in treatment of prisoners of war, unfortunately, Russia blocked all the actions. And that is why this topic should be more vocal. And that is why we, as also parliamentarians, our citizens who are families who are suffering, also civil society, we apply political and economical pressure on Russia to end abuses, really to support independent investigators and legal accountability. For us, it's important also, to document in a legal way according to international legislation, and of course, ensure protection and human treatment for all our prisoners of war, and not only our, but also globally, because it's really about standards. And when we are talking about emotions, for us, how to say, it's not about group of people. It's really about really individuals, and it's about human. And I can tell you also, when you meet these people, you really would like to help them at least a little bit to renovate them, because unfortunately in 100% they will never be restored in 100%.
So this is a psychological
really,
violence also that is being inflicted upon
yes.
these people, in addition to, as you've already mentioned, the mutilations, the sexual violence, the fact that they are being held in conditions which are completely beyond any sort of standards that we would have expected of a civilized country to apply to prisoners of war. there is also the psychological aspect. Now, can you also tell us briefly about another practice which was also described as a war crime, namely that the Russians are trying to force Ukrainian prisoners of war to join the Russian army and pretend like they are volunteers. They are describing them as volunteers, even though independent investigators said, well, it is not likely that they are volunteers. Most likely they were blackmailed or tortured into submission and into accepting the fate of basically joining the enemy against their own countrymen in this war.
You're absolutely right. First of all, this is one of the tools of Russia Federation, this propaganda machine. And this the purpose of this abuse also designed to intimidate Ukrainian soldiers, punish those captured, and also demoralize our society, and serves as you have mentioned psychological warfare against Ukraine as a whole, and not only against Ukraine. They would like other nations see that you see what will be with you. That is why, like, give up immediately, and that is why, of course, all this news and propaganda machine that Ukrainian soldiers are in Russian army. But Russia is really turning prisoners of war camps into tools of psychological warfare, and this must stop. And to stop it, I think that we should speak more about this, because accountability is not optional. War crimes really must not be normalized, so we shouldn't take this topic as a normality. And that is why, one more time, thank you to raise this topic more public. Russians, they are afraid more when they are criticized, and when also more public things, and then more sanctions and more pressure on Russia Federation to stop all the things, and of course to return our prisoners of war.
And it's not just prisoners of war, right? I mean, according to reports, if I may, according to reports, more than 50,000 residents of the illegally occupied parts of Ukraine were actually forcefully conscripted, again, into the Russian armed forces. Most likely, once again, this was done through blackmail and other types of intimidation, right?
You're absolutely right, because we think that also our citizens who are on temporary occupied territories, they are also hostages. They are also prisoners of war. And unfortunately, I even cannot imagine, but I hope that this number of war crimes will be not so big, but we absolutely know that there are so many war crimes and to rape women, men, boys, youth on temporary occupied territories. We know it, unfortunately, and that is why we are so insisting and pressure also by our political instruments to UN agencies, to International Red Cross, to be more present on that temporary occupied territories, to make these war crimes at least less than not so mashtab as we understand anyway the reality is. But it's also not only about civilians, because you know that prisoners of war is also civilian people who just they have a pro-Ukrainian position. I know also, as I'm responsible in our European Solidarity Party for Lugansk region, so at the very beginning of full-scale invasion, so people were only with the flag, they met Russian tanks and saying that we don't want you, or that, for example, so many villages is Ukraine, it's not Russian territory. And unfortunately, they were also captured and they are in the prison. And a lot of names we are not even now able to find in Russian prisons. And it's also about missing persons, because unfortunately, we understand that more like a lot of the biggest percentage of missing persons, unfortunately, probably they have been killed. But there are still so many people whose Russian even do not want to confirm that they are in Russian prison. That is why it is also important to speak about such war crimes that they are hiding. They are not only stealing our Ukrainian children, but it's also about our civilian people who are they do not want to confirm that they are in their lists. So
The
a
list
lot of
goes on,
problems, but I
unfortunately, the list
hope.
of those Russian atrocities. And unfortunately, we need to park our conversation here. Nevertheless, this is something about which the world has the right to know. Maria Ionova was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. A new study commissioned by the Russian government shows that nearly 130 Russian towns are facing extinction. Russia has been grappling with population decline and urban migration for the last several decades.
The towns in question are strewn across the Bryansk, Novgorod, Kirov and Krasnoyarsk regions. Combined, they are home to a population of close to 3.5 million people. Over the last 10 years, they have lost almost 315,000 residents. The communities most affected by this drop are those reliant on heavy industry or forestry. Russia's ongoing industrial crisis and population drift towards larger cities like Moscow have led to there being a risk of these towns vanishing entirely. This decline is also driven by issues such as job losses or the shutting down of key employment entities combined with these towns' aging infrastructure. The Russian government is reportedly working on plans meant to alleviate this problem by guiding investment and promoting infrastructure development.
The 17-year-old son of Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov has been chosen to oversee the distribution of Chechen humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. Adam Kadyrov has already been previously appointed to high-ranking positions within Chechnya's government, despite his age.
This latest appointment comes mere days after Chechen authorities made the decision to order all local charities to halt fundraising for the Gaza Strip. The reason behind this was an alleged lack of transparency and oversight. The only organization that was exempted from this suspension was the Akhmat Kadyrov Foundation, a charity that is commonly called Ramzan Kadyrov's personal wallet, and is reportedly funded through false donations from local businesses and citizens. The younger Kadyrov's appointment coincided with the resumption of aid by 3 other charities. So far, Chechen authorities claim that the region raised some $7.5 million worth of aid for the Gaza Strip. Adam Kadyrov has already served as his father's personal bodyguard and has held the position of Secretary of Chechnya's Security Council.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.